Thank y'all. So today we're going to talk about Automation 101, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this today because this is about 22 years of intellectual property for me, and now that PowerShell and all these things are out, I'm going to really share with you some things today that have been tricks of my career over the past 20-something years. How many of you are automating today or writing scripts, or how many are kind of new to it? So hopefully today, my goal is a couple things. So like I told you, my name is Michael Thomason. I've been automating probably for over 20 years. I started under MS-DOS 2.0 with batch and basically very low-level programming. So I've been around this. I've seen this evolve. So today what we're going to do is look at the history of Windows automation from where it started. We're going to take you through our history because it's important that you understand where we got from and where we're going, both in Server 2012 and in future releases. I had a company that did nothing but automation, and we still do that. I've packaged thousands of applications and designed probably thousands of tasks over the years, so I've seen a lot. A lot of people, when you come in these shows, they're going to come in and they're going to say, well, don't do this, do that. They're going to tell you exactly how to script. That's not my goal today. My goal today is, instead of telling you how to do something, I want to change the way you think, because if I change the way you think, then when you go back into your jobs, hopefully you will apply some of these things that we talked about today. And one of my favorite quotes is, if you do tomorrow what you did today, you will get tomorrow what you got today. So a lot of people are afraid of automation, or they're afraid to use some of these tools in their enterprise, or they're afraid to use them effectively. So that's really what we want to kind of do today, is take away the fear and then understand how to leverage and integrate these tools. So back in the dinosaur days of DOS, we really did not have a lot of options around automation. If you are not a C++ or an assembly programmer, your basic options were probably Batch, PowerBasic, and there were a couple of other tools on the market. But you really didn't have a lot of tools available to you. And then Windows came around. We had 3.1, we had 16-bit, and then we went 32-bit, and then we had NT. And our options got bigger and bigger. And we started having, so the Win API, is anybody familiar with the Win API? So that is the foundation for everything that runs in Windows. If you're executing a PowerShell command, you're calling some Win API call. If you're in .NET, at the end of the day, you're making some Windows API call. So Win API basically is how the registry is edited. There's tons of APIs around what's in Windows. But your automation options in the early days were still C, C++, and to make an API call. I could still do batch. We'll show you some batch today because batch can be pretty cool. I could write assembly. And then this little company called Wilson Windowware came out, and has anybody ever used WinBatch? So I'll show you WinBatch today. They were really the first. They were really ahead of their time. They're procedural based, which you'll understand later what that is, but they still have an excellent product. I'll show you the product today. It was an excellent scripting language for Windows, and you could compile it to an exe. And you could write in Visual Basic, Power Basic, and then our famous VB script came out in around 1996. When you're writing code, or you're writing a script, or you're writing PowerShell, one of the things that I want you to take away from today is your job is to write as little code as possible. Now, that's probably quite contrary to what most people will tell you. But your job today, in today's world, is to literally write as little code as possible. And you'll understand that why in the next slide. Focus on what you're trying to automate at hand. Don't get caught up in all the code at that point. Because remember, you're in the application or automation scripting business. You're not in the how to parse an XML file, or how to edit data, or how to edit the registry. That's not something you really want to get into, or even as a developer today, I don't want to get into. I want to use higher level tools. And a lot of times when you're scripting, we're all kind of guilty of this, where we let our ego get to us, because we want to write every line of code ourselves, and it's just not possible. The other thing when you start automating is you really want to choose your tools wisely. So every automated task you may solve with a different tool, just like when you work on your car or you work on something around the house. You may use a torque screwdriver, you may use a flathead, a Phillips, a pipe. There's various tools. You don't have to use the same tool. I mean, I find myself on a day-to-day basis sometimes, I might go from WinBatch to PowerShell to batch to, I mean, I'm all over the place depending on what I need to solve, how quick I need to get it out, what my target platforms are, and also the skill level of the people who will be executing maybe what I'm creating or what I'll be doing. So you kind of have to think in those terms as well. Before we can really talk about scripting, I want to let you know that there's basically two types of programming on the market. And basically two types of, so when we say programming, scripting as well, that you may not be aware of. There is procedural programming, which is the old way of doing programming. Has anybody ever done VBS? You can call objects in VBS, but basically what you're doing in VBS is called procedural programming. So you might write a function, you might write a subroutine, and then you'll use that subroutine in the lower lines of code. But it gets kind of tricky because you've got to manage all these variables and you can't really create a data set around a function. So that's called procedural code. Batch would be a great example of procedural code. But object-oriented really allows me to break up code in parts and then pull those parts in as necessary. Kind of like I do with procedures when I call in functions, but I can define data models around them. So if I need to parse an XML file, I can pull the XML down. If I need to connect to a database, I pull the database down. In VBS, if you've ever checked to see if a file exists or if a folder exists, you call the file scripting, create object, and I'll actually show you today what that actually is, so you'll know. You're actually instantiating an object. You're still procedural because you're calling it from a procedural language, but it's important to be able to call in these objects. Generally, the I/O is clearly defined, and it allows for code reuse. So once the developer has written how you connect to MS SQL and provide an object for it, you can use it in PowerShell, .NET, provided they expose the classes for it. This actually started, this was actually Steve Jobs. I put this up here. So Next, that was the whole thing. They were a hardware company, but they were one of the first commercial software companies to really go out and really do object-oriented programming and develop a whole platform around this. They're a little ahead of their time. And what's cool is while most DLLs, if you've seen DLLs, they generally have a lot of functions that are exposed, which is procedural. But you can also contain COM objects in a DLL, which I'll show you in another slide. So objects. When we talk about objects today, I'm going to give you the definition of objects from a scripting standpoint because it's important for you to understand that. But also when we talk about objects, I'm going to open your mind up to think about them in a little bit different way. So we talked about we want to rely on as few lines of code as possible. So we want to use objects as much as possible. And keep in mind that you can buy objects. There are companies that are just in the business of selling objects. So if you were doing an interactive app, for example, N Software is a company, an excellent company, and they sell protocols to do like XML parsing and SOAP. And you may say, well, Michael, you can do this in .NET out of the box. Yes, but there's some other languages. Chiclet Software, DevExpress, all these things here that you see on the screen here, you may not use in an automation or scripting environment, but these are components. Like here's a report designer. You see there somebody's design a report, 0 lines of code. That's actually an object, a whole report designer, and you can create a schema on how to do the reports. I'm actually going to show you logging. We're going to talk about logging today and how important logging is when you automate tasks. And I'll show you a company that just sells a whole logging engine. So you can buy these components. So before we get into the various things we would automate, one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about is when you get a task associated with you, whether it's build, 1,000 servers, or we need to create these users in AD, or we've got a mess we need to clean up. The first thing I do, and sometimes it's in a panic, it's like we have a virus outbreak, what do we do? Is I just try to step back, take a deep breath, and I try to figure out, okay, what am I going to automate? What is the task at hand here? And the next thing I do is I figure out if I was going to do this manually, how would I do it? Because if I don't know how to solve a problem, how can I automate it? So I step back. Sometimes that is harder to do because you may not know, because you may not be the app vendor. And that's when you use tools like sysinternals tools we'll talk about today. Sometimes knowing how to solve the problem can be a challenge. Then I determine how am I going to solve this problem based on the tools that I know. So, obviously you can't know all these tools. So, for example, I know C++. Everybody in the audience may not know C++. You may not want to know C++. That's okay. But go to the tools that you're comfortable with and figure out how to solve those problems. Now, if you start getting into tasks where your tool sets aren't solving the problems, then you have to say, okay, I need to expand my tool set. I need to put some more tools in the chest. And then I develop a script. And I'm real big on, and we'll talk about this, error trapping and logging, because this is the thing that I see most people when they're automating tasks, and it's a pet peeve of mine, but it will end up hurting you in your career, is you're not logging and you're not error trapping. So you're running these scripts and you say it works, you cut them in production, and then they break, either because you didn't test for error conditions, which we'll talk about, and then when it does break, you've got no idea why it broke because you're not logging in your code. So we're going to talk today about how important logging is and why to log. And then test. And I mean, I literally, if it's a critical task, I look at every use case for how that task is going to be done. And I'll actually, if I'm reading a registry key, I might delete that key, change the data type of the registry key. Anything that might happen in production, I will do to try to break that so that I make sure that my code is stable. And here's just an example of some other components here. Here's some mask editors and so forth that you can buy. Like here's a mask edit, and as you type the path, you see it's filling it in for you. So these are just all objects that you can buy. So we'll talk about, so now we're going to go into, so now we've kind of understood a little bit about the foundations of automation. So now we're going to shift to some tools that you can use. So the first tool that you can use to automate is Windows API. I could literally talk for 4 hours about the Win API. There's just so many of them. But basically it's the core set of programming interfaces. If you've run procmon and you see reg open, reg query, all those are API commands. You can look them up on MSDN. Keep in mind that the Win API is all C++ based. So when you read it, you're going to see there are Win API data types, but basically it's designed for a C++ programmer. So it can be a little daunting, especially if you're .NET trying to translate to the Win API types. And Microsoft is doing a better job of encapsulating that stuff in .NET classes. But you'll need to understand data types, and you'll basically need to understand how Windows works. Because I can go to the command prompt and just type reg, edit a registry. I can import the registry. But with the Win API, for example, I have to open a registry key. I have to specify the access of it. I have to get a handle to it. And then to query, I have to create a buffer. I have to pass the handle. So you're very low level. It's not just, let me just run, some of them are, and then some of them aren't. So you really have to know kind of how they work, and it's very time consuming. Another tool that you might go to in your tool set is batch. And batch is one of those things where, it can be more powerful than you may think, and I'll show you. It's been around, basically, like we said, since MS-DOS, but it's come a long way. Most people may not know that you can actually do multi-line commands with parentheses, which I'll show you today. It can be extremely powerful, but the problem is it's procedural, and it has poor error trapping. Basically, if you want to error trap in batch, you check error codes. So I'll show you. So I had a task the other day. I had to get it done quickly. I had like 1 minute to do it. And basically, I wanted to import, so I had a provisioning server image, and I only wanted to import this reg file if the machine was in standard mode. I needed it to be one way. I had basically 2 images. I wanted to make 2 image types out of 1 image. And the only difference in these 2 images were some reg classes and things that were registered. So basically, I created a log file. And I went in and I said, if exists, and I just created this flag on this drive, in this example, demo, and I look at the personality.ini, which is a file in provisioning server that's there, and I say, is it disk mode private? If error level 1 means it's not, that means, because fine, I'll show you error codes in just a second, then import the registry file, else private mode detected, skipping import, else echo no flag detected. And this is simple batch. You can see the parentheses here are nesting, so kind of like I start there and I stop there. So this is an example of a batch automated job. And it's completely able to troubleshoot. I could turn this over to somebody and say, if it didn't work, here's the log file, here's how to read it, and I wrote this literally in 1 minute. So don't count batch out. Another thing that I live in batch, so I love for loops. So I use for all the time. We'll talk about how to do this in PowerShell. Maybe I want to know how long some machines are up. So here I have a text file, so I could do for %f %in list.txt echo %i. And you can see I've got 2 servers here. So I created another file, time up, to show you today. All time up does is read a file that I pass it and then run the uptime command against it. So I'll do time up list.txt. And I can see that server 1's been up for 5 hours, and my Windows 7 box has been up for 3 hours. So a lot of times if I've got to, let's say, create a directory on 100 servers, I just put them in a text file. I could do this in PowerShell as well. Put them in a text file, run a for loop, do, make dir, and I'm done. I want to check to see if it's there. I just run the dir command, save it out to a file, run a find, and I'm good to go. So don't count out batch, especially when you need to get something done extremely quickly. I will talk a little bit about this guy. We won't spend a lot of time on him, but I do want to spend 1 minute on this language because it's been around since 1992. The slogan of the company is it's the consultant's secret weapon, and I will tell you, being in the business this long, it honestly has been my saving grace. This is a language I don't know. It's cool to learn. It has a 6 kilobyte runtime, so you can actually, it's very easy to learn. It's basic. So if you know BASIC, it's very easy to learn. You can actually create a Windows executable. That executable has no runtime dependencies, and I'll actually show you a couple today that I wrote. And it's a 6 kilobyte runtime, so it's like 6K, and the compiler fits on a floppy disk. The whole thing's written in assembly. It's still one of the fastest compilers on the market. It's complete object-oriented and procedural, which is cool. You can call COM objects in it. I've solved great problems with PowerBasic. Unfortunately, I can't go in and teach you PowerBasic in this thing. I can tell you that a lot of code running at Emory was in the early days, still is, the profile solution that we use to send and receive data to roam our profiles. I wrote back in 2000. We're still using that code today. And we've got like, I think we averaged, the users were complaining the other day because they had a 15-second login time with a roaming profile. So PB can be a very powerful tool and useful sometime if you don't know the target machines that you're hitting and you don't want to learn C. WinBatch. WinBatch, like we talked about, is a procedural language. It is very easy to learn. So if you're saying PowerShell is too much, which we're going to look at PowerShell today and really hopefully show you some cool stuff in PowerShell, and you're saying, look, this is just not me, but I need something, this is a great language for you. And I'll tell you why. You can pick up the phone and call these guys and say, how do I do something? And chances are they'll send you a document that'll show you how to do it. Or they'll actually stay on the phone and help you do it. There's plenty of examples online. Their support says, psychic tech support, because so many of these problems have been solved. So if you want to do a task, typically you can go there and they'll do it. There's over 4,000 functions, including extenders. So I'll just show you kind of. So Studio is the text editor or the IDE, and when you're done creating your file, you basically go up here to debug and you can compile. And if you look at consolidated will help, there's tons of, like if you do reg open, so here's an example of a function that you could call to open the registry. There's tons of them. I mean, if you look down here, you can see there's loading registry hibs, running something hidden. There's run with login. So if you want to run a process as a user, there's literally like 4,000 functions you can call. I can't go over them all in the room, but it's really easy to do, and they generally show you in the help file examples of how to do it. So if you click down here, they'll show you an example, and they'll show you, here's some code, they'll show you exactly how to run something as a user. Pretty reasonable tool. VBS, everybody's probably familiar with. Try to migrate away from VBS as quickly as you can. I do see this as a sunset technology, but it's still around. It is procedural, which means it can access COM objects, but basically the whole language is procedural, so you can only create functions and subroutines. It has very poor error trapping. Basically, it's error trapping its own error resume. And what's the number one thing we talked about in coding? Error trapping. So your script can bomb out, or it can just keep running. There's two parts of it. There's a W script and C script. So W script is the Windows side. C script is just the command line interface. And you got complete access to COM objects. Most people don't know, and I'll tell you that it's a variant based. So if you notice that it's a little slower, what it actually does is instantiates the COM object, which I will show you in a few minutes, and loads up all that stuff. So it doesn't really know about data types. You think it does, but it really doesn't. It actually uses variant data types. But a pro of this guy is there's excellent documentation, and there's tons of examples. It's been around since 1996. So chances are, if you can solve the problem in VBS, you may find the solution online. InstallAware is another, and Admin Studio and YScript. Does anybody ever use YScript? Nobody's ever used YScript. So you've got somebody said you know the history of YScript. YScript, again, is one of those tools that you always kept in your tool chest. You want it in your tool chest. And I'm actually glad Flexera, which is Admin Studio, has picked the tool up. What's cool about it is you can create a package, kind of like WinBatch, so you can compile, but you can also install files, and you can drag like edit registry over and create these nested blocks of ifs. But it's an older tool, and they really haven't updated it in a while. InstallAware is a competitor to it. InstallAware is an automation tool. It's a packaging tool, if you will. So its primary function is packaging, but it does have some functions and workflow in there that you can create. You can compile an executable, and you can create some workflow in there as well. And then there's what we call the command line interfaces. And remember I said earlier, what you think about objects, what developers and what we talk about is objects, and what objects might be available to you really are different. I see these guys as nothing more than objects. So there is a shift in Windows. So for years, if you wanted to edit the registry, you called reg.exe or you called regedit. We all probably know you pass it a reg file, it edits the registry. There's a trib, there's find, there's all these different, and I'll show you. Does anybody ever use event create? So event create's a really cool one. One of the things I like to log to is the event log. And here shows you some examples. So maybe I had a batch file, and I wanted to put an event in the event log that my task completed successful, like we did in the previous example. Or maybe I wanted to say it failed. I can just go in here and call event create task error, give it an ID code. And the ID is just a number you make up. So 1 might be I couldn't do something, 2 might be something else. Type application, D, and this is my detail, and you put your text in there. And this is built into Windows. Now this is a command line tool, so you can call it from Batch or PowerShell or anything. Of course, you could write natively the event log in PowerShell. But it's a cool tool, it's really easy to use. But think about it as an object that's available to you. Yes, it's a command line. It is a console application, so I don't think I put in this slide. When you compile a Windows app, when the developer compiles it, not really as an automation scripter, there's 2 types of executables that you can create in the header. One is called a Windows executable, which is basically the dialogues and all that, and you don't see the black box. And then if you ever clicked on executable and a black box pops up, and it either just goes away or you kind of see it. That is not a DOS command prompt. That is actually a console application. So command.exe is basically a console application. Now it has a command prompt and I can interface with it, but when you're writing console applications that are writing, there's 2 methods for the way they write. And you can research this. If in this thing, remember I told you there'll be a lot of homework, so you can write this down. There's standard in and standard out. So this is standard out, which means I can pipe this to a file. So I can do event create greater than demo.txt and event create O. And now I redirected, the pipe is redirect out, and I redirected that, as you see, to a text file. So anything that writes to standard I/O can be read in a buffer in PowerShell, which I'm going to show you later, but I want you to understand what's going on, or you can redirect it to a file, and that's called standard out. Some apps, some console apps, you may see that you pipe to and nothing shows up in the file. That means they're not using standard out to send out the data. They're using other ways to paint the screen, and you probably can't capture that. Some other tools that you might use, and I just put some up here, like a trib, find. Remember we did the earlier example? I wanted to know if the disk is in private mode. Well, that sounds like a complicated task. Let's get some PowerShell, but we just did it with a simple find command. We looked at the exit code, which I'm going to show you exit codes. Disk part, I actually wrote a whole command line tool just using disk part where you could create these templates and then I could apply them all built around the disk part command line. Server manager, NSLOOKUP, ping, NetSH are all that configures network adapters but doesn't configure a lot of the stuff that we really need configured, which is always a great tool. So your really only way to interface with these guys, with these command line tools, is two ways. You can look at error codes, or you can read the text and parse it. Now, if you're reading the text and parse it, it gets kind of complicated, because if you're multi-language, you're going to have to be able to accommodate for multiple languages. But I did want to show you error code. So over breakfast, I wrote a quick one-line Power Basic. This is a good Power Basic demo. And all I'm doing is whatever you pass in on the command line, I'm creating a value, which is an integer of it. And then I'm just exiting the executable and passing that. So we'll run this. I'll do 9. And it's 9. Or if I say, and by the way, you can see that exit code is 9 kilobytes, and I wrote it over breakfast. So not that you would need something to show you an exit code, but it's kind of neat. So what happens is when you run all these command line utilities, so let's take the find command, for instance. The find command, if you pass it a string and it finds that string, it's going to return 0, which is success. Now, generally, 0 means success for most command line tools, but it's not guaranteed. The problem with error codes is they're not always well documented. So when I write a command line tool, if you write something, I always publish what my exit codes are. Some people, including myself, think that that's exit being success is really false, because in the API world, or Boolean world, false is 0, so we don't like that. So we would make it 1. So you have to be careful, but for find, I happen to know. So all these tools like NetSH and most all the command line tools will return to you an error code. So if you're doing automation around them and you're calling error codes and you want to know if your task was successful or not, you can check the error code. And when we start looking at the workflow part of this, I think that'll make a little more sense. Another thing that you really need to know when you're automating is you better be getting really best friends with the sysinternals tools, and you better know how to use them. And that includes my favorite procmon. I have a word that I tell everybody that works with me, thou shalt procmon. It's one of my 10 commandments. You would not believe what I find just by reading a procmon. And so if I'm trying to automate something, maybe I have an app config that needs to be copied out, some database config, and I'm like, where is this stored at? You know, it's not a DSN file. Is it in the registry? Where is it at? I just procmon it, and I don't have really time to demo it today. I put PS star up here because there's a whole list of, like if you want to run a process on a box, there's PS exec. If you want to list processes, there's PS list. So I could also do PS exec So PS exec has a whole command line to it. You can also pass out multiple computers, or you can do a file. So you can say PS exec act list.txt IP config flush DNS. Put all your servers in a text file, it'll flush your DNS for you automatically. So IP config is really, the PS exec tools are really powerful to learn. Before we get into PowerShell, so we need to get moving, because we got a lot of the cool stuff's coming. Well, I want you to understand about the component object model, because most people don't know this. And this stuff you just sometimes can't get in the book. But COM is basically, all ActiveX is basically DLL that contains objects. So I'm giving you the Michael definition today. So ActiveX is basically a DLL that's registered that has a bunch of objects available to you. How many of you have done this? That FSO create object equals scripting.filesystemObject. I create the folder, but you have no idea where scripting object come from. You don't know anything about it, basically. You just know it works. Let's be honest. So I'm going to show you today where scripting.object comes from and how it knows. So all it is, when you do scripting.object, what Windows does as part of COM is it's going to look up and it's going to search for the scripting.object. It's a class ID that's registered in the root. And you can see, there it is, file system object, and its class is scripting.filesystemObject. And its class ID is this GUID, and then it references that prog ID, which is that GUID, in proc server, and you can see the DLL is SCR run. So really what you're calling when you're running that is it's basically instantiating SCR run. And I promise you that if you run a procmon and you run your VBS, you will see SCR run loaded. Now you can go to Microsoft and you can say, what is, how do I use this? This is an object. Create folder is one of the things they expose. They expose a lot of things, which I'll show you. So let's find this object in here. The Windows scripting runtime and interfaces, and you can see here's the folder, and inside here there is a path, get last access, and create text file. There should be a create folder in here. Might be under file system maybe. Yeah, get folder. So there's all, copy folder. So this is all the things that are exposed with this object. This is all documented on MSDN. So again, this is another object. There's tons of other objects, but this is how basically COM works. So if you think about it, COM is just a bunch of objects that are exposed in a DLL that you can call, similar to PowerShell commandlets. I'm also going to spend a slide talking about syswal64 because I find most people that work for me do not understand about Windows 64-bit. And it's important because I tell you this, because when you're writing automation tasks, especially on 64-bit systems, this is the things that you will probably want to know. Windows generally comes in two flavors. I know there's ARM now. I know there's other processors, but generally there's 32-bit and 64-bit systems. And we all know that we can run 32-bit processes on 64-bit systems. If you've automated before, you may have seen some quirks on that. There are two quirks that you have when you do this. The first problem is a DLL actually maps to so Windows is a virtual memory only operating system. Your paging file is not virtual memory. Virtual memory means I'm going to write, as the app owner, I'm just going to allocate memory and I'll let the OS generally figure out where it goes. I can keep those pages in memory, or I can keep those pages on a disk, but I'm going to let the OS manage that. Yes, as a developer, I can force them into the paging file, but for our example. To do that, I have to create an address space, and a 32-bit address space and a 64-bit address space are not compatible. So that means that 64-bit processes cannot load a DLL that compile for 32, the same way a 32-bit cannot compile for 64. So that explains why. So for COM objects, what did I tell you earlier? It's important that you know commandlets and COM objects are what? At the root of the day, they're what? DLLs. They're all DLLs or processes. And you will run into issues with that. So when you write a 64-bit executable, it can only call a 64-bit COM object. When you write a 32-bit executable, it can only call a 32-bit COM object. The only exception is if your you can contain COM objects in executables. So a service can register himself as a COM object and connect, but in that case, you would still need to register it in a 64-bit context and a 32-bit context. The reason I tell you this, and I will show you this when we look at this, when we look at the registry, is if you call WScript from System32, you're running the 64-bit version of WScript. If you call WScript from syswhile64, syswhile64, you're calling the 32-bit version of WScript. So if you have bought some third-party components that you're having to interface with, or some of your applications like Citrix ICA, for instance, maybe you're automating something, it's a 32-bit process, and you're calling it in the 64-bit version of WScript or CScript, what's going to happen? It's going to error out, because there may not be a corresponding 64-bit COM. They're completely different animals. So you can see that by let's do a quick demo here. So I just asked, this is a 32-bit executable, and I said, what is your path to program files? And what did it return back to me? Program files x86, not program files. I asked it program files, it returned x86. This is the reflection part of Windows. I'm a 32-bit process, so it's going to keep me in this 32-bit world. The same way in the registry, you see the WOW 6432 node, and you see the regular node. The WOW 6432 node is where 32-bit apps write, and the 64-bit apps write in that. The same way also, if you have a 32-bit process and he calls something in the path, especially for Windows, where is he going to go to get his Windows binaries? Not System32, he's going to go to syswhile64. So just keep in mind. So what I've done to keep it easy is I've gone into the syswhile64 and copied WScript and CScript to WScript32 and CScript32, and I just kind of keep it clean for that. But you just have to remember that there's two. When you're especially on 64-bit systems, when you're writing tasks and scripts, you have to keep this into effect. There is, when you edit Windows, if you edit a registry key, and WinBatch definitely documents this, and at the API level it does, you can actually disable, this is called reflection. So if I'm a 32-bit process and I edit a registry key, it goes to the syswhile32 by default. I run something, it goes to syswhile, it's called reflection. You can disable, a process can disable file reflection. So I can do that, and then I can access those paths natively. Or if I edit the registry, I can send, when I open the key, I can tell the OS, I want to actually write to the 64-bit node, and that's called disabling registry reflection. And those are documented, and the WinBatch help document is a good example to kind of dives into that, kind of explains it and that kind of stuff. Not that you need WinBatch, but I wanted you to be aware of reflection. On newer operating systems, you can actually call sysnative, and you can, I think, run stuff from, sysnative is a folder that's created. It should be on this box, but you can look it up. I may not be calling it correct. And if sysnative exists, you're running on a 64-bit box, and that'll actually be the native the native to the OS. The reason they call System32 and not System64 is there were so many apps hard-coded to System32 that they had to keep it around for backwards compatibility. So System32 is actually 64. It's kind of bad nomenclature. And then our old friend, WIMI. So we've seen batch, we've seen all these tools so far. We have not gone into PowerShell, and there's a reason. We're about to go there. But there was a problem in that we needed to get like hardware serial numbers, and we kind of wanted to make it easier to create folders and find files and do automated tasks. So Microsoft says, oh, let's just create this whole interface. Let's create an object called WMI, and then we'll expose other people can put their own objects in there, and then we'll have this whole interface and you can just call it. Well, the problem is it's completely overcomplicated. There's all these moth files, and if you ever used it, it sometimes fails you more than it helps you. So generally you find yourself holding your breath thinking, is WMI properly running on this box? And if it is, then okay, good. And if not, or if you breathe at it wrong, it's kind of flaky. So WMI is still a huge part of Windows. It's not going away, but it's still there. You want to get a hardware serial number, it's a great way to do that. And basically it's an object. It's an object with other objects associated with them. It's a platform, basically. It's been around since NT and Windows 95. Vendors can provide their own WMI interfaces. When you edit a WMI object or you get data, there's two types of data. There's read-only data and read-write data. So some properties you can actually edit and change. Others you cannot. And those are all documented. And two tools that you can use when you're automating using WMI is WMIC, which is the command line tool, or you can do WBM tester, and you can start looking at namespaces, and you can go through and do queries and this kind of stuff, and then kind of put these in your platform scripts. Sometimes on a box, there's also a link here I sent you to a couple of WMI tools, so you've got some homework there. Sometime you need to rebuild your WMI repository, and you want to run the Winamp verify repository on Win7 stuff, and it'll actually go through and recompile your MOFs and those type things. The other tool is WinRM. So I showed you PSExec. We talked about PSExec. I want to run something on a remote host, and that uses a protocol. Does anybody know? PSExec, what protocol does it use? RPC. And RPC is the old SMB, port 145, port 445, very insecure, although I know SMB3 is more secure. But it's flaky, and it times out, and the box is offline. So Microsoft said, let's just encapsulate all this stuff in HTTP and HTTPS, and they've written a great platform for WinRM, and I'm going to show you WinRM. This is your homework assignment. Learn to use WinRM. It actually backports to Windows 2003 if you still have some environments there. WinRM is an excellent tool, and we're going to show you WinRM today and the power you can use it. But look how easy it is. Here's a Windows 7 box. So WinRM/R server 1 IP config. Server 1. And I just ran ipconfig for my Windows 7 box. It talked to the server and ran ipconfig and returned it back on the screen. So 87.135 is actually the IP address 130. I could have ran an MSI command. I could have imported a registry file. I could have done whatever I wanted. Now keep in mind, when you run WinRM, you're running, actually, the process is running on that box. So if you're importing a reg file and the file is local on your desktop, it's not on the server when you reference it. And if you use UNC paths, you have to make sure trusted sites and all that stuff set up. So there are some setups and quirks to it, but at the end of the day, it's a powerful tool. So if you had a list of 100 servers and you want to run a command, pop them in PowerShell, which we'll show you. I'm going to give you some tools today to do that, but an excellent tool for it. So now we're going to stop. No, not stop the presentation. What have you noticed so far? So far in this presentation, you should have noticed that products and applications basically are all API-based, and there's generally standard input and outputs. There's no real standard, and there's GUI and command line all over the place. We've been all over the place the past 30 minutes. So we can't get to where we need to go this way because it's too complicated. It's too confusing. So Microsoft had to come up with another platform, and they've made transformational changes to the OS. And it's important to understand that PowerShell is not just a scripting language, it's a transformational change to the OS. And what they're doing is so in the 80s and the 90s, well, the 90s, they created a hardware abstraction layer. which we could now not have to have OSs compiled to individual platforms. We have this whole hardware abstraction layer. Now we're creating the data center abstraction layer, and PowerShell is a part of that. So basically, I can pop in all these PowerShell commandlets. If you notice, almost all their products now are going PowerShell. Almost all third parties are going PowerShell. We finally have one tool, one place to do everything with a predefined model. I implore you to watch this YouTube video from the inventor of PowerShell. And he will himself, in 15 minutes, tell you the vision for what Microsoft is doing, and you will better understand why you need to get on the PowerShell bandwagon. But I wanted you to understand where we got, and I wanted you to understand these legacy tools, because these legacy tools are driving a lot of this flow. So it's a true automation framework, like we talked about. Like Exchange was the first to adopt it, so if you do a GUI thing in Exchange, then it's in there. Microsoft now mandates that PowerShell for all of their products. Not only that, like you can team NICs now, you can set duplex settings via PowerShell now. There's so many things now that you can do that you could not do before. For the first time, the Unix guys are jealous, because guess what? They've got like 15 different scripting languages they've got to learn, or 30, and we still do too, but we now have a consistent place to do things. One of my things for Windows has always been, it's a repeatable, consistent process. So you can bring somebody off the street, look at your Windows server, there's not 50,000 ways to do things. And some of the Unix guys are getting a little jealous, and guess what? This is just the beginning. Microsoft is serious about cloud, and the only way to do cloud is horizontal scalability, which I talked about. The only way to grow your enterprise with less, because if you're like me, you've got less resources to work with and less budget, is you've got to learn to automate the things that you used to do. And finding a script off the internet and pasting it into our one-line script is not automating. Automating is taking all these things together and scaling your environment out. Now, I'm going to zip up for you and send to you, and we'll figure out where they will be, or I'll give you my email. I have a PowerShell, I did not write this, but I have a PowerShell quick start guide that if you're new to PowerShell, I think you should read it. It talks to you about the data types. It's just a quick couple pages. So before you start coding or you go buy a book, just spend some time and read it and then dive into it. Some of you may be PowerShell pros. One of the cool things I'll show you today is how you can pipe things out and do things in one command. And I'm also going to send you home with iCommand, which is one of my favorites. It's written by a guy that works with me, David Lee, who's brilliant. He actually has an MSDN article that talks about iCommand that I've got to get, but I'm going to show you iCommand. So let's dive into some PowerShell demos, shall we? So maybe I want to gen a list of servers. So here's a list of, I just quickly generated a list of servers starting with, I think, 1 to 3,100. Maybe these are Citrix servers. So if you look at the code here, get server name, which is a PowerShell script I wrote that we could look at if we had time. But basically, I wrote a function called get server name that you give it your initial abbreviation, and then it generates a list of server names for you. And then I could say, so instead of this, I'm going to do list.txt, get content, read from file, ping. So here's a ping monitor that you could use. So here's a PowerShell script. So see the pipe here? So get content means read this file, and for every line in the file, pass that to ping monitor. And all ping monitor does is continually run to see if these boxes are up. So you could do the same thing. We could do we probably passed too many and all these boxes are offline. So what would happen is these boxes eventually they'll all start showing up, they'll show red because they're offline. The same way I could run get contents, C:, list, Nope. ICMD-demo PS1. So iCommand is a PowerShell function that David wrote. And what's cool about PowerShell is you can give it either a text. In this example, I'm giving it a text file, so I'm doing the get content. And it'll actually, in this case, I ran ipconfig on both boxes simultaneously. I purposely have WinRM disabled here. So I got an error here, because you would need to test for that. And I have server 1, and you see it's got this data here. And what's cool about it is then you could just do $ICMD. I want the first one, .success, and it's false. So I know that one failed. So let's go to the second one. And I know that one's true. And I will do .1.result. And there is the result of the command that ran on server 1 via WinRM. Now, in order for you to do the iCommand, that requires WinRM, not psexec, although you could call psexec. iCommand is a wrapper for the built-in PowerShell invoke command that stores all this stuff in arrays so that when you're done, you're left with an object that you can manage, and of course, I'll give it to you. So while you can go and write PowerShell, a script here and a script there, what you typically want to do is create like a module repository, which is what I've done in this case. So I've created a PowerShell script that generates server names. I've created another PowerShell script that pings computers. We've created another one called Ping Monitor. And then I can create just kind of a database, if you will, and then start leveraging all of my objects in and using them at will. Now, there's tons of PowerShell objects we'll talk about. And if you want to see these tools, just for time's sake, because we've got to move on, if you want to see these functions afterwards, because I know we're moving a little fast, I've got all day. So I can take my laptop. If you want to see the functions, you want to see the share, if you want to dive more into this afterwards, we'll do that. If you kind of want to see the code for all this, but I'll zip up to you. He actually wrote another one that he's documenting that does multi-threaded execution. So if you wanted to run things multi-threaded, you can do. So I won't have time really for the sake of time because we've got to get into some of the workflow tasks, which is even cooler, I think. But one of the things that your homework assignment is to basically learn basic regular expressions. You can go buy an 800-page book on regular expressions. But for example, in the thing we just got with the ipconfig, where it gave you the IP address, maybe you want to extract out just the machine subnet or IP address. You can do all that with a regular expression. So regular expressions can be difficult to learn, but instead of you having to write all this left and right and data parsing, you can just say, here's a string, here's what I'm looking for, and I want to know if I have a match. And regexbuddy and regmagic are great tools for if you want to do it in a GUI and kind of see how it works. Keep in mind there were regular expressions. Java has its own regular expression engine, PowerShell. Each regular expression engine has its own quirks in the syntax. So just keep that in mind as well. So what we've showed you so far is we've got all these tools that are a solid environment for scripting. But what you're missing here is workflow. And the other thing that I see when you start automating these tasks, I have no doubt that even if you're new to PowerShell or new to scripting, that in a couple of weeks or months, you would be able to go and write some basic scripts. Everybody in this room, I have complete confidence. But I want everybody in this room that are writing those scripts today, now we're going to shift, and now we're going to really see the power and how to automate horizontal scale, because now we want a workflow. And I'm going to tell you the thing right now that I tell everybody and all the developers, stop putting workflow in your PowerShell scripts. So just like PowerShell has objects, the command lines have objects, you yourself, while you can create your own command lines, think about the PowerShell things you're writing as objects. So ping computer, generate a subnet, maybe for your Citrix servers, you want to know if IMA is started, or whatever, a file server, landman server. So you write a function, is landman running? And all you do is check the service. That's pretty, and that's just a function you call. But how do you know? What if you want to say, if it's not running, I want to stop the service, and then I want to start it, and if it doesn't start, I need to be alerted for it. Do you write all that in code? Remember I told you earlier, don't only write code when you need to. So what you want to do is break your code up into automation pieces. Before we talk about that, remember I warned you that scripts are not always going to execute as designed. And when you develop code, you will need to run in various runtime scenarios that you will encounter. And remember my three: logging, exception tracking, and solid test plan. And always, I'm going to tell you a story about me: develop and test, promote and prod. Years ago in my career, I was in a hurry because we needed to, this is when Blaster came out and we had patched some boxes and we needed to get some patches out. And I did not test a script that I wrote that got a list of all computer objects in the domain. And I queried a list of all computer objects, including servers, and ran the script, and it rebooted the entire production environment in one night. I tell you that because I'm not perfect. Now, I have a track record of writing and testing in production and not breaking it down. And generally, 9 times out of 10, I do a great job at that, but sometimes I don't. So if I'm writing scripts to maybe delete an object in Active Directory, well, what if you accidentally grabbed all of them? You see how powerful this pipe is. What if you piped a whole list and deleted all your machines in Active Directory? So be very careful in what you're doing. So we talked about breaking the code up. There's ways to break code up. And when you break code up, you want to use automation products. The first one I'll show you is Final Builder. And that's not good. But I have another demo for you that's not expired. So Final Builder is a workflow automation tool that was designed for software developers. I'm sorry that I can't show you the demo, but I will tell you about it. And then I'll show you a similar demo of a product that I think is even better. I can go in and I can create advanced workflow. So just like I told you before, what's cool about it is it's got about 600 actions. So maybe you need to FTP a file down from a server, parse some data, do some stuff, and then send it back. Well, guess what? It's got an FTP down option. So you just drag it in and say, I need to FTP. And then you parsing the data, maybe you write in PowerShell. You write that yourself. And then when you're done, you send it back. And what's cool about Final Builder is you can say, okay, if this fails, keep going. But if this doesn't, it's all in a GUI, and it's all right there on your box. So if you want something that you can create task workflow for and use all of these tools that I've showed you today and automate them and create nested workflows, so you can create like a nest and say, okay, restart print spooler, and have a whole series of things, and then you can nest that in something else. It's a great tool for that. The downside is it doesn't really have agents, and like if you're connecting, you're having to use like WinRM and other protocols. How many people have used SCCM Orchestrator from Microsoft? Hopefully you will after today. Orchestrator, I'm so excited about it because there's some things about it that I want to change. So a couple years ago when I got into Final Builder, I really wanted Orchestrator, but I really liked the power, and I still like the power of Final Builder. But Orchestrator really is just incredibly awesome. What it allows me to do is create workflow management. And then I can deploy these things with runbooks. And that's not even, and that's cool, which I'm going to show you today. But what's cool about it is now Microsoft has gotten huge into Orchestrator, and they're saying, well, we'll provide tons of objects. So they have an Active Directory import that I've done for you. They've got an Exchange import. They've got, you name it, there's tons of these little object workflows. So I have a workflow that I created. And you can nest these runbooks, but here's an example of one I just made up here. So basically what I said is, so I first say example, and example is a computer group here, right? So I create a computer group example, and I put 2 machines in them. And I said, first thing I want to do is run this, and I just created something that logs to a file. And then I say, okay, then I link to, if I ran this program and it returns success, then I want to stop the print spooler. Now notice, I didn't have to write any code to stop the spooler. I didn't have to go into PowerShell and write it. I didn't have to do anything. So I go in and I say, run from, so whatever I ran before, whatever computer object I ran before, I want to stop the print spooler, and I can specify security and other things. And then I'm going to restart it from whatever computer I ran before. And what's my pet peeve? Logging. So I link here. If it returns success, send an event to the event log. If it's false, write print spooler could not be started. So I'll go in the runbook tester, and I will run this. And my laptop's a little slow, but you can see that it's running these tasks. This is similar to Final Builder, but it's really cool. So it's going and it's doing all this workflow, and I've not written any PowerShell right now. All this has just been drag and drop. And I'm done. So let's go on to my client here, and I better see a corresponding I think this is the last year I'm not on SSD for a laptop. Yes?
So the orchestrator, is that, do you have to buy SCCM to get that?
You know, that's a great question, and I'm not sure. You'd have to talk to somebody that knows MS licensing. So I can see right now on, and my clock is wrong. That's why my evals are expired, because my laptop battery's dead. It thinks it's 2001. I can see that it ran this run book, and that little log run thing that I wrote, which does nothing but just log to a text file. I can see that today in 2001 it ran, and there was the command line that it passed. And log run's just basically as a tool I wanted to show you how you can run processes. I don't have the source, it's just a quick PB app. So what's cool, and that's cool about Orchestrator, but what's cool is, let's go back. So that's my runbook tester, so let's get out of that. So look at here, here's Windows Azure. Here's certificates, cloud services, deployments, storage. Here's Active Directory. If I want to add computer to a group, I just drag it in here. Now I've got to work, now I can create workflow around it. And keep in mind, I can schedule things, I can monitor for things, so I can say get computer IP address, get process status, and all these are part of Orchestrator, and you can download these templates. But what's really cool is you can even run, let's see what, all activities. There's a applet here that you could actually do, I forgot what it's called, but you could call a PowerShell. So you can say, I want to run, and it'll drop it on there, and then you can just paste in some PowerShell code right there. So you can actually either call PowerShell from inside of Orchestrator, or you can paste in C#, PowerShell, JavaScript, or anything right to it. So the important thing to take away from Orchestrator is how you can create workflow around, because this stuff is really complicated to do in code. And it even gets more complicated the more nested that your workflows get. So just imagine creating a workflow around server reboots, around building, let's say you need to build 100 VMs, you know? So I wanna allocate the storage. Okay, does that fail? No, it doesn't. Okay, I wanna provision the VM, configure the NICs, and some of these things you may do in just a drag and drop right there on the screen, or some of these things you may have to write PowerShell objects for, but then you create your workflow, and it has a web-based interface too, which is really just even better. So you can create workflow for your help desk, so you can create a workflow for them, and they can check the status of their jobs, when they ran, how they ran, if they were successful. So you literally could create run books. So like, instead of getting called in the middle of the night, you could create a workflow. Maybe print spooler stops or whatever, you could create a workflow, put it in here, and create a document that says, run this before you call me, which is kind of nice. Okay, so for time, we're going to move on. So putting it all together, basically, there's a lot of pieces that we talked about today. We talked about a lot of stuff. You could run processes, you can write PowerShell code, and we talked about a lot of puzzles. But what you want to be able to do is put all these back together so that you create a solution. And in order to do that, I want you to take away from this. Use objects as much as possible. I think you've seen today the power in objects. I can almost do anything with an object, and if I can't do it with an object, I can write some additional functions really quick, things like generate subnet and so forth in an object. But in order to use these objects, one of the biggest challenges is knowing where all these objects are at, because there's like thousands of them, is know-how. I have to know how to use the tool before I can use it. So whatever tool I'm doing, I've got to know that. So that's some of your homework. And once you combine objects and know-how, then you will have true automation. And when you have true automation, your single task that you can create can be completed in the same amount of time, pending build-up time and stuff of an automated process, but for your time would be equal to your same time that you could build one. And that is true horizontal scalability. I think there was one. Yes, so logging. Remember when you log that you can log to a file, you can log to the event viewer, you can send an email, and actually in Orchestrator you can actually send emails and all this stuff. There is a third-party company called, and there's different, you can create different log levels, and logging can be difficult to do. There is a third-party company, like I told you, Gurok Software, that I use, and they're really relatively inexpensive. And you can use they have a .NET product, and I can basically just instantiate their logger, and then I can say, you know, log message, hello world. I can say log error instead of log message, and it'll actually throw an error in the log. I can subscribe and say when I write this message, send it to the event log at the same time. So it's just another object for logging, or you can create your own. And I think I put an article in here as well to kind of how to do logging. So we got any questions? We've got a couple minutes.
The orchestrator, does that like compile a PowerShell script when it runs?
No, you're using the runbook designer or there's like you can run through command lines and stuff. But no, you're actually designing workbooks and you're designing runbooks, and then you're running those runbooks. But you can compile PowerShell and stuff in there. You can't export runbooks and take them to other consoles, but you can't take them, export them out, and then run them, you know, independently. Yeah.
Do you recommend using for creating a UI for PowerShell?
What do I recommend creating a UI for PowerShell scripts? You can do almost all the .NET form stuff. So you could create like a DLL in like C# or .NET, and then just call that and get that data back. Or you could actually call the form creation stuff. There's some examples online directly from PowerShell.
You ever try PowerShell?
PowerShell.
Yeah, it's a software out there that you can literally drag and drop the objects and create a UI.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so then there's a third-party tool as well. Well, but again, if it's, you know, saving you a lot of time, because it's a lot of time to create a form and a DLL and so forth, it's called PowerShell Studio. So yes, appreciate that, letting everybody know that. So if you want to create UIs, it sounds like PowerShell Studio is a great tool for that. So I'll be around for a while afterwards. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me. I'll be glad to tell you, give you any information you need. Thank you for coming today.